The conflict known as the Great Turkish War emerged from a period when the balance of power in Eastern and Central Europe was shifting under immense pressure. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had stood as one of the most powerful states in the world, controlling vast territories across southeastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Its armies had advanced steadily through the Balkans. Its rulers commanded enormous authority, and its influence shaped trade, diplomacy, and military affairs across several continents. To many in Europe, the Ottoman Empire represented both a military threat and a political reality that could not be ignored. By the 17th century, however, the situation had become more complicated. The empire remained powerful, but also faced increasing strain. Governing such a large and diverse territory required constant military strength, efficient administration, and reliable resources. Internal political struggles, regional unrest, and the growing military capabilities of European rivals created challenges that became harder to manage over time. Despite this, the Ottomans still possessed one of the largest armies in the world, and their rulers continued to pursue expansion where opportunities appeared. The frontier between the Ottoman Empire and the kingdoms of Central Europe had long been a zone of conflict and tension. Fortresses, border towns, and contested territories formed a landscape where war could erupt suddenly and where alliances mattered deeply. The Habsburg monarchy, centered in Austria, stood as one of the main powers resisting Ottoman expansion into Europe. This rivalry had already produced decades of warfare before the Great Turkish War began. At the center of the coming conflict stood the city of Vienna. Positioned along the Danube River, Vienna was not only a major political and cultural center for the Habsburgs, but also a strategic gateway into Central Europe. If Vienna fell, Ottoman influence could spread much deeper into the continent. If it held, the advance of the empire might finally be checked. Because of this, the city carried importance far beyond its walls. The Ottoman leadership believed conditions favored a new campaign. The empire still possessed immense manpower, and its military tradition remained respected and feared. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha became one of the leading figures pushing for expansion against the Habsburgs. He believed that a successful assault on Vienna could secure Ottoman dominance in the region and restore momentum to the empire's military reputation. At the same time, Europe was politically divided. Rivalries between Christian states often prevented cooperation against common threats. France competed with the Habsburgs for influence. Poland faced its own internal problems, and many German states were more focused on regional concerns than large-scale unity. These divisions appeared to create an opportunity for the Ottomans to strike before a strong coalition could form. The Ottoman campaign toward Vienna in 1683 was massive in scale. Armies moved across the Balkans and into Habsburg territory with enormous logistical support. Soldiers, engineers, artillery, and supply systems advanced together in preparation for what was expected to be a decisive operation. The movement of such a force demonstrated the continuing power of the Ottoman military machine. As the Ottoman army approached Vienna, fear spread across Central Europe. Many believed that the city could not withstand a prolonged siege against such overwhelming numbers. The Habsburg rulers scrambled to gather support, while Vienna itself prepared for defense. Fortifications were strengthened, supplies were collected, and soldiers along with civilians braced themselves for what would become one of the most famous sieges in European history. The siege began with intense pressure. Ottoman forces surrounded the city, cutting off supply routes and bombarding defenses with artillery. Engineers dug tunnels beneath the walls in an attempt to weaken the fortifications through explosives. Inside Vienna, defenders struggled against exhaustion, hunger, and constant attack. Every day increased the danger that the city might collapse. Yet beyond the walls, efforts to save Vienna were already taking shape. The threat posed by the Ottoman advance forced several European powers to cooperate despite their differences. One of the most important figures to emerge during this moment was King John, the Third Sobieski of Poland. Sobieski was an experienced military leader who understood that the fall of Vienna would endanger not only Austria, but the wider balance of Europe. An alliance gradually formed between the Habsburg monarchy, Poland, and several German states. Though their interests were not identical, they recognized that allowing Vienna to fall could transform the political structure of the continent. This alliance represented more than military cooperation. It symbolized a growing realization that the Ottoman advance could only be resisted through combined effort. As the siege dragged on, conditions inside Vienna became increasingly desperate. Defenders fought continuously to repair damaged walls and repel assaults. Food supplies declined, casualties mounted, and uncertainty spread throughout the city. Many understood that without outside relief, Vienna could eventually fall. The approaching relief army carried enormous importance. Its commanders had to move quickly while coordinating forces from different regions and traditions. Timing was critical. If they arrived too late, the city might already be lost. If they attacked too early without preparation, they risked destruction against the larger Ottoman army. The stage was now set for one of the defining confrontations of the 17th century. The Ottoman Empire stood at the height of one final great offensive in Central Europe, while a coalition of European powers gathered to resist it. The outcome would shape not only the fate of Vienna, but the future balance between the Ottoman world and Christian Europe. The Great Turkish War was about to begin in full force. What started as a siege would grow into a long and brutal conflict stretching across Hungary, the Balkans, and beyond. It would involve massive armies, shifting alliances, devastating battles, and a transformation in the balance of power that would echo across Europe for generations. As the siege of Vienna continued, the tension surrounding the city grew more intense with each passing day. The Ottoman army had surrounded the Habsburg capital with overwhelming force, and its commanders believed that time favored them. Their artillery bombarded the walls continuously, while engineers worked beneath the ground, digging tunnels designed to destroy the city's defenses from below. Every explosion weakened the fortifications further, and inside Vienna the defenders struggled against exhaustion, hunger, and constant fear. The defenders knew that they could not hold forever without outside help. Supplies were running low, casualties increased daily, and entire sections of the walls had been damaged by artillery fire and underground mines. Yet despite these conditions, resistance continued with determination. Soldiers, militia, and civilians worked together to reinforce weak points and repel repeated assaults. The survival of the city depended on endurance. Beyond Vienna, the coalition forming against the Ottomans moved with urgency. The Habsburg rulers appealed across Europe for assistance, warning that the fall of Vienna would place Central Europe in grave danger. This call for support was answered most significantly by King John III Sobieski of Poland. Sobieski was already respected as a skilled commander, experienced in warfare against both Ottoman and Tatar forces. He understood that the struggle was larger than the defense of one city. If Vienna fell, the balance of power throughout the region could shift dramatically. Sobieski led Polish forces southward to join with Austrian and German troops gathering to relieve the city. The coalition army represented a rare moment of cooperation among powers that often distrusted one another. Political rivalry had not disappeared, but the Ottoman threat was severe enough to force unity. Commanders coordinated strategy carefully, aware that failure would leave Vienna isolated and expose much of Central Europe to further advance. The movement of the relief army was difficult. Large forces required food, supplies, and communication across rough terrain. Timing mattered greatly. If the coalition arrived too late, Vienna could already be lost. If they attacked recklessly, the Ottoman army might destroy them before they reached the city. Every decision carried enormous weight. Inside the Ottoman camp, confidence remained high. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha believed victory was close. Ottoman forces still outnumbered the defenders, and sections of Vienna's walls were near collapse. Yet the siege also revealed weaknesses. Maintaining such a large army over time created logistical strain, and the longer the operation continued, the greater the pressure became on Ottoman organization and supply. The decisive moment came in September 1683. The coalition army reached the hills overlooking Vienna, preparing for a direct confrontation with the Ottomans. The battle that followed became one of the most famous engagements in European history. It was not simply a clash between armies, but a turning point in the struggle between empires. The coalition forces launched coordinated attacks across the battlefield, gradually pushing against Ottoman positions. Fighting was fierce and prolonged. Infantry advanced through difficult ground, while artillery exchanges filled the air with smoke and noise. Both sides understood the importance of a moment. Victory or defeat would shape the future direction of the war. Late in the battle came the event that entered military legend. Sobieski led a massive cavalry charge down from the hills, including the famous Polish winged hussars. The attack struck Ottoman lines with tremendous force and helped break their position. Combined with pressure from Austrian and German forces, the coalition assault shattered the Ottoman army's ability to continue the siege. The Ottoman retreat from Vienna marked a historic turning point. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had often appeared unstoppable in southeastern Europe, advancing steadily through conquest and military strength. The failure at Vienna changed that perception. Instead of continuing expansion into Central Europe, the empire now faced the possibility of strategic retreat. For the European coalition, the victory carried enormous symbolic and political significance. Vienna had survived, and the Ottoman offensive had been stopped. Celebrations spread through many European courts, where the battle was seen as a defense of Christendom and a major reversal of Ottoman power. Yet the war itself was far from over. The defeat deeply affected Ottoman leadership. Kara Mustafa Pasha faced severe criticism for the failed siege and retreat. In the political culture of the empire, military failure at such a scale carried serious consequences. Confidence in Ottoman leadership weakened, and internal tensions increased. At the same time, the coalition recognized that Vienna's survival created an opportunity. Rather than simply defending against future attacks, European powers now considered pushing deeper into territories controlled by the Ottomans. The war was beginning to transform from defense into counteroffensive. The Habsburg monarchy in particular saw a chance to reclaim lands in Hungary that had been under Ottoman control for generations. Hungary had long been a contested frontier, divided between Ottoman authority, Habsburg influence, and local powers. The victory at Vienna encouraged Austrian leaders to pursue more ambitious goals in the region. New alliances also began to form. Encouraged by Ottoman weakness after Vienna, additional states joined the struggle. The Holy League emerged as a coalition supported by the papacy and involving Austria, Poland, Venice, and later Russia. Though these powers had different interests, they shared a common desire to reduce Ottoman influence. Venice focused heavily on the Mediterranean and the Balkans, hoping to regain territories lost to Ottoman expansion. Russia, still emerging as a larger European power, viewed the conflict as an opportunity to expand southward and challenge Ottoman control near the Black Sea. The war was becoming broader, involving multiple fronts and ambitions. As campaigns expanded into Hungary and the Balkans, the nature of the conflict changed. The Ottomans were no longer conducting a grand offensive towards Central Europe. Instead, they were increasingly forced to defend fortresses, supply lines, and territories that had once seemed secure. This shift altered the psychological balance of the war as much as the military one. Despite the defeat at Vienna, the Ottoman Empire remained powerful and dangerous. It still controlled enormous territories and possessed large armies capable of fierce resistance. The empire was weakened but not destroyed. Future campaigns would prove difficult and costly for both sides. By the end of this stage of the conflict, however, one reality had become clear. The Siege of Vienna had marked the end of an era of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. The initiative was beginning to pass to the Habsburgs and their allies. What followed would be a long struggle to determine how far that reversal would go and how much of southeastern Europe would change hands before peace finally arrived. After the failure of the siege of Vienna, the momentum of the war began to change in a way that few would have imagined only a few years earlier. For generations, the Ottoman Empire had represented expansion, military strength, and pressure upon the frontiers of Central Europe. Now, for the first time in a major way, the empire found itself reacting to the advance of its enemies rather than dictating the direction of the conflict. The victory at Vienna had not ended the war, but it had transformed its character. The Holy League, strengthened by success and encouraged by the visible weakness in Ottoman strategy, moved from defense into sustained counteroffensive campaigns. Austria, Poland, Venice, and later Russia all pursued their own goals within the alliance, but together they created pressure on the Ottoman Empire across several fronts at once. This made the conflict far more dangerous for the Ottomans, because resources and armies had to be divided over a wide geographic area. The Habsburg monarchy focused heavily on Hungary, which had long stood at the center of Ottoman and Austrian rivalry. Much of Hungary had remained under Ottoman control for more than a century, governed through military administration and defended by networks of fortresses. These territories were strategically important because they formed the buffer between Ottoman lands and Central Europe. If Austria could reclaim Hungary, the entire balance of the region would shift. Campaigns in Hungary were brutal and exhausting. Armies marched through devastated countryside. Fortresses were placed under siege, and disease often killed as many soldiers as battle itself. Warfare during this period depended not only on courage in combat, but on logistics, engineering, and endurance. Capturing a fortress could take months of bombardment and starvation, while defending one demanded constant discipline under terrible conditions. The Ottoman military still possessed experienced soldiers and strong defensive positions. The Janissaries remained respected infantry, and Ottoman cavalry continued to fight with effectiveness across open terrain. Yet the empire increasingly struggled with coordination, supply problems, and internal political tension. Defeat at Vienna had damaged confidence, and repeated campaigning placed pressure on both commanders and administrators. Austria, meanwhile, was improving its military organization. The Habsburg rulers understood that success required permanent armies capable of sustained operations. Cooperation with German states and support from the Holy League gave them greater resources than in earlier periods. Over time, the Austrian military became more disciplined and capable of conducting large-scale offensives. One of the most important moments came with the capture of Buda in 1686. The city, which had been under Ottoman control since the 16th century, carried enormous symbolic and strategic value. Its recovery by Habsburg forces represented much more than the fall of a fortress. It marked the return of a major Hungarian center to Christian control and demonstrated that Ottoman authority in the region was beginning to weaken seriously. The siege itself was intense and destructive. Ottoman defenders resisted fiercely, knowing the importance of the city. Coalition forces launched repeated assaults while artillery battered the defenses over weeks of fighting. Casualties were heavy on both sides, and when the city finally fell, the event sent shockwaves across Europe and the Ottoman world alike. The fall of Buda encouraged the Holy League to continue pressing forward. More Hungarian territories were reclaimed, and Ottoman armies were increasingly forced into defensive operations. The psychological effect of these reversals became almost as important as the military consequences. For decades, many European states had feared Ottoman expansion as nearly unstoppable. Now the empire appeared vulnerable. Venice also achieved gains during this period, especially in the eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans. Venetian forces targeted Ottoman possessions connected to trade and naval movement, seeking to restore influence lost in earlier conflicts. Although Venice lacked the manpower of larger states, its naval tradition allowed it to remain an important participant in the war. Russia entered the conflict more actively as well. Under growing leadership ambition, Russia saw the weakening Ottoman position as an opportunity to expand influence toward the Black Sea. Russian campaigns in the south were difficult and often slowed by logistical challenges, but they marked the beginning of a longer Russian involvement in Ottoman affairs that would continue for centuries. Inside the Ottoman Empire, the pressures of war contributed to instability. Military defeats weakened confidence in leadership, while economic strain increased frustration across parts of the population. Maintaining large armies over extended periods required enormous resources, and repeated setbacks made recovery increasingly difficult. Political struggles within the empire complicated efforts to respond effectively to the changing situation. Despite these challenges, the Ottomans remained capable of fierce resistance. Several campaigns showed that the empire could still field dangerous armies and defend strategic positions with determination. The war did not become a simple collapse. Instead, it was a long contest where Ottoman power declined gradually under sustained pressure. One of the most decisive confrontations came at the Battle of Mohacs in 1687. The name itself carried historical weight because another battle at Mohacs in 1526 had shattered medieval Hungary and opened the path for Ottoman dominance in the region. Now, more than a century later, another battle near the same area symbolized a reversal of fortune. The Habsburg victory at Mohacs strengthened Austrian control over Hungary and further damaged Ottoman morale. It became increasingly clear that the empire was losing its ability to dominate the frontier as it once had. The balance of power in southeastern Europe was shifting steadily toward the Habsburgs and their allies. As territory changed hands, populations across the region experienced enormous disruption. Villages were destroyed, trade routes were interrupted, and civilians often found themselves trapped between advancing armies. Refugees moved across borders seeking safety, while local loyalties shifted according to survival and political necessity. The war reshaped not only borders, but the daily life of entire regions. Religious identity also remained deeply connected to the conflict. Many European rulers presented the war as a defense of Christianity against Ottoman expansion, while the Ottomans viewed their struggle through the traditions of imperial warfare and Islamic legitimacy. Yet political ambition and strategic interest were always present beneath the language of religion. By this stage of the war, the Ottoman Empire had clearly lost the initiative it once possessed. The Holy League was advancing. Major fortresses had fallen, and Habsburg influence in Hungary was growing rapidly. Still, the conflict was not finished. The Ottoman state remained vast, and complete victory against it would require even more years of campaigning, negotiation, and sacrifice. The Great Turkish War had become more than a defensive struggle around Vienna. It was now a broad transformation of power in Eastern and Central Europe. The campaigns ahead would determine how much territory the Ottomans could preserve, how far the Habsburgs would expand, and what kind of balance would emerge from one of the most significant conflicts of the 17th century. As the war continued into its later years, the Ottoman Empire faced a reality that had become increasingly difficult to ignore. The defeats suffered since Vienna were no longer isolated setbacks that could be reversed through one successful campaign. Instead, they formed part of a larger pattern in which the balance of power across southeastern Europe was steadily changing. Territories that had once seemed secure under Ottoman authority were now contested or lost, while the armies of the Holy League advanced deeper into regions long controlled by the empire. For the Habsburg monarchy, this stage of the conflict represented an opportunity unlike any it had experienced in generations. Austria had spent centuries defending against Ottoman pressure along its eastern frontier. Now, instead of fighting for survival, Habsburg rulers were expanding their influence into Hungary and beyond. Each captured fortress strengthened their strategic position and weakened Ottoman control over the region. The campaigns themselves remained extremely demanding. Warfare in southeastern Europe was shaped by rivers, mountains, fortresses, and long supply routes. Armies could not simply move freely across the landscape. Every advance required careful planning, engineering skill, and constant access to provisions. A successful campaign depended as much on logistics as on battlefield courage. The Ottoman military still possessed experienced commanders and determined soldiers. In many engagements, Ottoman resistance remained fierce, especially around fortified positions that controlled important crossings and trade routes. Yet the empire increasingly struggled to replace losses and maintain the same level of organization that had once made its armies so feared across Europe. Inside the Ottoman state, political instability added to these military difficulties. Changes in leadership, struggles within the court, and dissatisfaction among parts of the military weakened the empire's ability to respond effectively. The Janissaries, once considered one of the most disciplined military forces in the world, were no longer as reliable or unified as they had been during earlier centuries of expansion. Economic pressure also grew severe. Long wars required enormous spending, and maintaining armies across multiple fronts placed great strain on the empire's finances. Trade disruptions, taxation, and the cost of military campaigns affected both the government and ordinary people. Similar pressures existed among the members of the Holy League as well, but the Ottomans were increasingly fighting from a defensive position, which made recovery more difficult. The Habsburg armies continued pushing through Hungary, consolidating territory that had changed hands repeatedly over generations. Castles and towns that once served as Ottoman frontier defenses were gradually absorbed into Austrian control. The symbolic meaning of these victories mattered deeply. Every recovered city reinforced the belief that Ottoman expansion into Europe had reached its limit and was now reversing. At the same time, Venice pursued its own campaigns in the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. Venetian commanders focused heavily on coastal strongholds and naval operations, attempting to secure routes that were valuable for trade and military movement. Although Venice was smaller than Austria or the Ottoman Empire, its maritime experience allowed it to remain influential throughout the conflict. Russia also became more active as the war expanded. Russian rulers viewed Ottoman weakness as an opportunity to increase influence near the Black Sea and southern frontier regions. Though Russian campaigns often faced logistical difficulties and harsh conditions, they represented the beginning of a growing Russian role in southeastern European politics. The Ottoman leadership attempted several efforts to stabilize the situation and regain momentum. New commanders were appointed, fresh campaigns were organized, and efforts were made to restore discipline within the army. Some Ottoman counterattacks achieved temporary success, reminding their enemies that the empire still possessed considerable military strength. Despite this, the overall direction of the conflict continued to favor the Holy League. The Ottoman Empire was no longer dictating events as it had in earlier centuries. Instead, it was reacting to pressure across multiple fronts while trying to preserve territory and authority. This shift changed how European rulers viewed the empire. Fear of unstoppable Ottoman expansion gave way to a new belief that the empire could be contained and even pushed backward. One of the most important developments of this period was the growing Austrian dominance in Hungary. By reclaiming much of the region, the Habsburg monarchy transformed itself into a far stronger power within Central Europe. Hungary was not only strategically important, but economically valuable and politically significant. Control their increased Austrian influence for generations to come. The populations living across the war zones suffered enormously during these years. Armies consumed crops, damaged villages, and forced civilians to flee their homes. Disease spread easily among crowded camps and devastated communities weakened by hunger and instability. Entire regions experienced repeated cycles of occupation, siege, and destruction. Religious identity continued to shape how the war was described by leaders on both sides. Many European rulers framed their victories as the defense of Christianity against Ottoman power, while Ottoman authorities presented the conflict within the traditions of imperial legitimacy and military duty. Yet beneath these religious narratives, the war remained deeply connected to territory, resources, and political ambition. As years passed, exhaustion spread across all participants. Even victorious powers faced financial strain and military fatigue. Soldiers who had spent much of their lives campaigning across Hungary and the Balkans grew weary, and governments understood that endless war could weaken even successful states. Because of this, diplomatic discussions slowly became more important. The idea of negotiating a settlement gained support as rulers considered what they had already achieved and what further campaigning might cost. Austria had gained enormous advantages. Venice had secured important territories, and Russia was expanding its influence. The Ottomans, though weakened, still controlled a vast empire and remained capable of resistance. The struggle was gradually shifting from battlefield decisions toward questions of peace and political settlement. Every side now had to think not only about military victory, but about what kind of balance would exist after the war ended. Europe itself had already changed because of the conflict. The Ottoman Empire, once viewed as the great advancing power of southeastern Europe, was increasingly seen as an empire under pressure. Austria emerged stronger and more confident, while Russia began to appear as a rising force in Eastern affairs. The final outcome of the war would determine how permanent these changes would become. It would decide which territories remained Ottoman, which passed into European hands, and how the balance between empires would be reshaped after decades of struggle along one of the most contested frontiers in the world. As the long conflict finally moved toward its conclusion, all sides understood that the Great Turkish War had changed the political structure of southeastern Europe in ways that could not easily be reversed. Years of campaigning, sieges, and shifting frontiers had exhausted armies and strained governments across the continent. What began with the Ottoman siege of Vienna had evolved into a massive struggle involving Austria, Poland, Venice, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire itself. Entire regions had been transformed by war, and the final settlement would decide how this new balance of power would be organized. By the final years of fighting, the Ottoman Empire was no longer in a position to launch grand offensives into Central Europe as it had in earlier centuries. The defeats after Vienna, the loss of key territories in Hungary, and the pressure from multiple enemies had weakened the empire's strategic position. Ottoman armies could still resist fiercely, and many fortresses remained difficult to capture, but the momentum of expansion had clearly ended. Austria stood as one of the greatest beneficiaries of the war. The Habsburg monarchy had transformed from a defensive power struggling to protect its frontier into a major force expanding deep into former Ottoman territory. Large parts of Hungary that had been contested for generations now came increasingly under Habsburg control. This dramatically strengthened Austria's influence and helped establish it as one of the dominant powers in Central Europe. The campaigns that produced these gains had been costly and brutal. Fortresses along the Danube and throughout Hungary became symbols of endurance and sacrifice. Cities changed hands after long sieges, and entire landscapes were marked by destruction. Yet despite the suffering, the Habsburg rulers understood that their victories were creating a new strategic reality that would shape Europe for generations. Venice also secured important territorial advantages during the war, especially in parts of the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. Venetian leaders viewed these gains not only as military success, but as protection for trade routes and maritime influence. Although Venice was no longer the overwhelming naval republic it had once been, it remained capable of playing a significant role in Mediterranean politics. Poland's involvement, particularly through the leadership of King John III Sobieski during the relief of Vienna, became one of the most celebrated parts of the conflict. Sobieski's intervention at Vienna was remembered across Europe as a decisive act that helped halt Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. However, despite this military prestige, Poland itself continued to face internal political weaknesses that limited its long-term influence. Russia emerged from the war with growing confidence and ambition. Though its role during much of the conflict was smaller compared to Austria, Russian participation marked the beginning of a much larger historical pattern. Russia increasingly viewed itself as a major power in southeastern Europe and around the Black Sea. Future wars between Russia and the Ottoman Empire would continue this struggle for influence over the region. Inside the Ottoman Empire, the effects of the war were profound. Military defeats weakened confidence in leadership, while economic strain and political instability made recovery difficult. The empire remained vast and powerful, but the image of unstoppable Ottoman expansion had been permanently damaged. The state could still defend itself and remain influential, yet the direction of history had begun to change. The war finally moved toward formal conclusion through the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. This agreement became one of the most important turning points in Ottoman and European history. For the first time on a major scale, the Ottoman Empire ceded significant European territories to its enemies through diplomatic settlement. The treaty recognized the new realities created by years of war. Austria gained most of Hungary along with other important territories, greatly expanding Habsburg influence. Venice secured gains in parts of the Balkans and the Mediterranean region. Poland recovered territory as well, while the Ottomans were forced to accept substantial losses that reduced their position in Europe. The Treaty of Karlowitz represented more than the end of a war. It symbolized a major shift in the balance of power. For centuries, European states had often viewed themselves as defending against Ottoman advance. After Karlowitz, the pattern increasingly reversed. The Ottoman Empire became more defensive, while Austria and Russia emerged as expanding powers in southeastern Europe. The psychological impact of this transformation was enormous. European rulers who had once feared Ottoman conquest now believed the empire could be pushed back through coordinated military effort. The victory at Vienna and the treaties that followed created a new confidence within Central Europe. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire began a long process of adaptation. Leaders recognized that military reform and administrative change were becoming necessary if the empire was to remain competitive against European powers that were growing stronger and more organized. Some efforts at reform would follow, though the challenges facing the empire remained immense. The Great Turkish War also revealed how warfare itself was evolving. Large standing armies, coordinated alliances, artillery, engineering, and logistics played increasingly central roles. Success depended not only on bravery, but on administration, finance, and long-term planning. States capable of sustaining these demands gained enormous advantages. For ordinary people living across Hungary, the Balkans, and surrounding regions, the end of the war brought relief, but not immediate recovery. Years of destruction had devastated villages, disrupted trade, and displaced populations. Rebuilding homes, farms, and communities would take decades. The war had reshaped borders, but it had also reshaped lives. Religious identity remained an important part of how the conflict was remembered. In much of Europe, the defense of Vienna became a symbol of resistance against Ottoman expansion. In the Ottoman world, the war represented a painful but important lesson about the changing balance between empires. Yet beneath these religious narratives, the struggle had always been equally about power, territory, and political survival. The Great Turkish War marked the end of one historical era and the beginning of another. It did not destroy the Ottoman Empire, but it ended the period when the empire could dominate Central Europe through continual expansion. Austria emerged stronger, Russia began rising toward major power status, and the balance of southeastern Europe shifted permanently. What began with the siege of Vienna ended with a new political order. The frontiers of empires moved, alliances proved their strength, and the struggle between great powers entered a different phase. The consequences of the war would continue to influence Europe and the Ottoman world for centuries, shaping diplomacy, military strategy, and the future of entire nations long after the cannons had fallen silent.